Hello again, it's Lisa Thomas with Remax Complete Realty here in Calgary. Today we'll be continuing the series on the agency and representation forms. I hope that you enjoyed the overview of the exclusive buyers representation forms. Today we're going to go over the exclusive sellers representation form. Now let's get started. Okay everyone, here we go again. Today we're going to be going over the exclusive sellers representation agreement. Again, I'm going to draw your attention to what this is saying here is that this is for use in designated agency brokerages. Remax Complete Realty is a designated agency brokerage, so we're using the correct form. Again, first item that you fill out is the contract number. You can use maybe the house number and then the seller's initials or whatever it is that you like to use for your contract numbers. Remax Complete Realty name goes here. Seller 1, and if there's a second seller, they would go here. The next section, number 1, is all about the property. And so you would put the legal address on this line. The next thing that is outlined is what is included in the purchase price. And so here you would typically put appliances that are included, maybe window coverings if there's blinds and drapes on the windows. The next portion that you would fill out is anything that might be excluded from the purchase price that is part of the home. So one example would be sometimes people want to take the drapes, so they may put that that's excluded. Sometimes there may be a freezer down in the basement or something. You might want to indicate there that the freezer is not included. This section here is for the legal description, and this is to be filled out if you are selling a standalone detached residential property or a duplex. If you are selling a condominium, what you're going to want to do is check off this box, and then you have to include the condominium property schedule. That schedule can be found within web forms as well under representation forms. And within that document, it outlines the condo fee, it outlines who the management company is, it outlines any legal descriptions for the condominium. The other schedule that may need to be attached if you are selling a country residential property, there is also a schedule in web forms that you would download and fill that schedule out and add it to this agreement. Point number 1.2 is where we put the price that we are listing the property for. And this amount needs to include the GST. Most situations, there is no GST. However, you could maybe be listing a new property for a builder, and GST might be something over and above the purchase price. So you're going to want to make sure that you add the GST as well as the property value and have that totaled here on this line. For the proposed possession date, really I typically just put what the seller is wanting there, and that is something that's negotiable once the offer comes in and we're negotiating price and closing dates and things like that. Point number 2 is just outlining that Remax Complete Realty, who is actually named on the contract, gives you, the listing agent, the right to work on behalf of the seller. And so your name would go here. Point number 2.2 is talking about if something was to happen and you were no longer licensed, or maybe you moved brokerages, how that would be handled. Either the client would go with you to your new brokerage and this listing agreement would be canceled, or your seller may want to stay with RE/MAX Complete Realty, and RE/MAX would then designate a different agent to work on their behalf. Okay, and 2.4 is where we are going to put the date that this agreement is signed and then when it will end. So usually I put the date that I'm meeting with the client and they sign this. It may be, a couple of weeks before the listing's actually going to go live. But the reason I get them to sign it now rather than waiting until the day before it's listed is that it gives me the ability to order photos and have measuring done and having the assurance that we are under contract at that time. And so I know I'm not wasting my money and having photos and measuring done and then the client decides not to sign this listing agreement. Hope that makes sense. Point number 3 talks about RE/MAX Complete Realty's responsibility. And basically they need to be impartial in dealing with you and any other buyers represented by us in the property. And they are to oversee us as the agents and make sure that paperwork is done properly, making sure that we are behaving in a way that is within our guidelines. They can hold the money that is received in trust, and they will provide copies of the agreement to the seller as soon as possible after they're signed. We actually provide the document to them once it's signed. And then it talks about the designated agent's responsibilities. These responsibilities are something that we've already outlined when we went over the guide with them. And so just refer the client back to that document that you've already covered. Point number 5 talks about the services that we're going to be providing to that seller. So first of all, it's talking about the fact it's going to go onto the MLS system. I put here that yes, I will be putting a lockbox on the property. Some agents will, rather than put a lockbox on the property, will just use the door code if somebody has a front door code. I typically do not do that. And the reason I don't is it's a security issue. So by having a lockbox on, we can tell who it is that's accessed the lockbox and then entered the home, because they've had to use their credentials to open the lockbox. If you're just giving the front door code to somebody, you have no way of knowing who showed up, when they showed up, and when they left. So I always put it on for security reasons, even if there is a door code. The next line, you're going to put all of the services that you're going to provide the seller. Try and put as much detail in this section as possible, because it really outlines what it is you're going to be doing for your seller to sell the property. So you might indicate that that you'll have professional photos done, professional measuring done, that you will be the type of maybe social media that you'll be posting on, the fact that you're going to negotiate favorable terms for them with the offer to purchase, that you're going to assist them through to completion. Be as detailed as possible. The next section, section 2, talks about the responsibility of the seller. And so they will need to be providing the real property report showing the current state of the property. So when you're meeting with them on the first meeting, make sure that you ask them about the real property report if they have it. If they have it, ask to view it right then to make sure that it's actually up to date and accurate. If they do not have a real property report, it is very important that they reach out to a surveyor and get the ball rolling to have that real property report redone, because you're going to have to provide that to the buyer prior to closing. So to avoid any delays, I recommend tackling that one in your first meeting. The seller has to ensure that there is insurance on the property up until the point that possession day happens. So they would have, usually possession happens around noon on the day of closing. So they just have to make sure that they have insurance on the property up until that point. The seller needs to be communicating and cooperating with us. We're on the same team, so they have to be keeping us updated on any changes in their situation. They would have to let us know if there was any change in title. So, for example, maybe they're deciding to separate or divorce and there's going to be a change in title. They need to be keeping us updated on all of that information so that we can properly do our job. The seller also needs to ensure that they have enough money to with equity within the property to cover the mortgage that is outstanding, any penalties that they might have for maybe getting out of the mortgage sooner than the end date. They have to ensure that they have enough equity to cover the commission amounts that they're going to owe. And usually what I do in every situation is I ask the client to get me a statement of their mortgage that outlines what the balance is going to be if there is any penalties, and that way I can do the calculation myself and make sure that they are fiscally able to sell this property. Point number 7 talks about the warranties and the representations that the seller provides to the buyer. And so they're going to warrant that they do have the authority to sell the property, that nobody else has any legal right to the property or any of the goods that are attached or unattached in the property. They would have to let you know if they were operating on a third-party principle, and that all the information they provide us on the home be true to the best of their knowledge. Okay, the seller is also warranting that the building is currently being used in accordance with municipal bylaws, that there is not any easements or right-of-way, or there's no fencing that's been built on the neighboring property. So again, the real property report is really important to be able to determine some of these things. Let's see. And that the land and buildings are currently being used for what in accordance to the building permit that they have. And this one is very important as well. They need to disclose that they are not a non-resident of Canada for the income tax purposes. If they are not a resident of Canada, there could be tax implications, and so we would need to know about that, and they would have to have some advice from an accountant and a lawyer just to make sure that everything is dealt with there. Point number 8 talks about the dower of consent. This would be filled out if there was only one person on the title, but it's a husband and wife that are selling the property. So if they are a married couple, but only one person is on title, they would have to fill out a dower of consent. What this is there's actually two forms that they would need to sign off on. This is the spouse that is not on title. They would have to meet with a lawyer and sign off on two forms indicating that they understand that the property is being sold and that they are in agreement with that. Okay, now at the bottom of each page, you're also going to see where it says seller's initials and brokerage representative initials. So you're going to initial for brokerage representative. They are going to initial at the bottom of each page for the seller's initials. Point number 9 is talking about conflict of interest. And so they need to understand that it is not a conflict of interest for us to show their property maybe to a buyer that we're representing. It also goes into what would happen if you as the agent was representing both the seller and the buyer. And so in a situation like that, if you were representing both sides, both the buyer and the seller would have to agree that they are okay with that representation. And we just have to conduct ourselves according to the Consumer Relationship Guide, which outlines the difference of our responsibility if we are negotiating or if we are acting as agent for both sides. So with that, basically what we end up doing is we're more of a facilitator of the transaction. We can give both the buyer and the seller market information so that they can make informed decisions about the offer price or counter offer price, but we have to treat both sides equally. We cannot provide favoritism to one side over the other. Point number 10 talks about the commissions that we will be charging. So the first line indicates the full amount of the commission that they would be paying to the listing brokerage. And so, for example, you might see that it says 7% on the first 100,000 and then 3% on the balance. That's one that we see. However, always remember that commission is negotiable, so it's not a hard and fast number. 10.2 would outline the amount of the commissions that we would be offering to the buyer's agent. So if we had the 7% and 3% on the first line, we would probably put on the second line that the buyer's agent would receive 3.5% of the first 100,000 and 1.5% of the balance. Okay, point number 10, this is talking about what would happen if we had the property listed and then it's no longer listed and the seller ends up selling the property to one of the buyers that was introduced to the property during the listing. So if that was to happen and the seller had not signed a new listing agreement with another agent, chances are they would owe us our commission amounts for that deal because the buyer was introduced to the seller's property at the time that we were under contract. Okay, point 10.4 just outlines that the seller agrees that our brokerage can use the deposit that they receive from the buyer to cover some of the commission amounts. And if there's outstanding commission amounts due, that be paid within 3 days of the sale completing. Okay, and you must instruct the lawyer to deduct from the deposit and proceeds of sale or money forfeited by or recovered by the buyer the amount that you owe us under the agreement. Okay, they do not need to pay a fee if the property is sold to somebody that was excluded from the agreement. So for example, maybe you're planning to list a revenue property, and the seller indicates to you that the tenant may have interest in purchasing the property and that they're going to be talking to the tenant about that. Maybe they'll want that tenant excluded from this agreement. So if the tenant buys, that the seller does not have to pay you a commission. I would highly recommend, though, that you flush out the likelihood of that tenant buying before you agree to do that. Here, 10.7, this is where we can ask the seller to reimburse us for any of the costs that we have if they change their mind and remove the property from the MLS system. So for example, you may say, if you change your mind and remove the home from the MLS prior to the end date, that they will reimburse you for the cost of the photos and the measuring. And what I would do in that situation is give them the copy of those photos and the measurements so that they can use them in future. So they're really just buying those elements from you. Okay. This is all pretty self-explanatory. Okay, point number 11 talks about personal and confidential information. So again, any personal information would remain confidential. Any personal information about the seller. The information that would not be confidential is just information that's required about the property itself. And they give us consent to collect, maintain, and use in the listing the information that's required in order to market the property professionally. And that they also need to give consent or acknowledge the fact that their name is going to be showing up on the MLS system. It's not for public viewing, but that other agents will be seeing their personal information. Again, the seller's initial down here, you initial at the bottom here. Okay. Point number 12, ongoing obligations. So this is just reminding us that any confidential information that we have has to remain confidential even after this transaction completes. Okay, audio and video recordings. If your seller has audio and video equipment in the home, I have a discussion with them and explain to them that they should not be watching what's the showings and listening to what the buyers and buyers agents are saying while they're in the home. Unfortunately, we have no way of guaranteeing that doesn't happen, but I usually do discuss it with them just so that they know that it's really not a fair level playing field if they're listening in on private conversations. Indemnification, what this means is if there's any issues that any claims or legal action that may happen due to misinformation that the seller provided to us, that we are not responsible for that, and they provide us with indemnification against that. Point 15 is talking about property information. And so this is where they are going to outline any issues that the property might have. So are there any material latent defects in the property? Hopefully the answer is no. Do they know of any defects that would be expensive to fix? You answer that. Check the appropriate boxes for these. Have they received any government notices or local authority notices? Are they aware of any lack of permits for any of the development on the property? So you're going to answer all of these, and I usually get the seller to then initial beside as well. So this point here, do you know of the lack of the lack of any permanent permits on a property, I would usually look at the remap documents, and if there's a basement that's developed in the home and we can see it's developed, do some research on the background just to make sure that permits were pulled for that. Because if you indicate that everything does have a permit to the buyer and it doesn't, you can find yourself in a little bit of a predicament. So just make sure that you do your homework there. Additional terms. This is usually where I put the date that I believe the home is going to be listed on MLS. So again, they might be signing this agreement a week or 2 weeks prior to the listing going live. So you need to acknowledge here the date on or before the certain date that it will be listed on MLS. Point number 17 talks about early end to the agreement. So if the relationship's maybe not going well, or the sellers decide that they no longer want to sell the property, we are able to end these agreements before the end date. We just have to make sure that that is done in writing, and then a cancellation form would need to be signed. And we can set up those terminations as a conditional or an unconditional termination. Then if there's anything else about this agreement that you want to attach additional items, you would just indicate that here on this line. Then it also tells us that any future changes to the agreement must be in writing and signed by both. And so if there was any change that happened on this agreement, for example, maybe you decide to do a price reduction, you're going to want to do an amendment to this agreement. And that amendment form is also found in web forms. These points are all just housekeeping type information. So it's just, outlining the fact that, weekends or business days do not take into account Saturday, Sunday, statutory holidays, things like that. Words with a singular meaning may be plural. So it says buyer, which could be buyers. Okay, point number 19, the seller acknowledgement. So the seller is basically acknowledging that they have read this agreement, that they have read and had reviewed the consumer relationship guide. They acknowledge that the agreement creates a sole agency relationship with us, as the guide describes. And they have had an opportunity to get any independent advice from a lawyer or tax advisor if need be. And the agreement accurately sets out what we have agreed to. The seller information goes here and here. The brokerage information is here, and your agent information goes here. Put the date that this document is signed. The sellers sign here and here. You are going to sign here on this line. We both initial that bottom page. Once we provide them with a copy, they're also going to initial here and indicate the date and time that they've received a copy of the document. Okay, now if it was a dower situation, the spouse that is not on title would sign here. Okay, so they would not be signing through the whole document because their name is not on title, but they will have to put their signature here as the non-owning spouse. And that concludes our section on exclusive sellers representation agreement.